CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Juliette Mann. Our top stories. Working for longer. French President Macron's pensions reforms are unveiled with plans for the retirement age to rise.
Our other headlines: with more public sector strikes planned, the UK government proposes legislation forcing minimum staffing regardless of industrial action.
China stops issuing short-term visas to South Korean and Japanese visitors, describing Seoul's entry restrictions as discriminatory.
And Britain's hopes of becoming a destination for the launch of satellites takes a hit after Monday's attempt to make space history ends in failure. Details of President Macron's plans to overhaul France's pension system will be unveiled in the next hour or so, with the reforms likely to make or break his second term as leader.
Macron has pledged to raise the minimum retirement age from 62 to 64 or 65. The minimum pension, however, is expected to increase for new retirees to around $1,200 a month, or 85% of the minimum wage. And the government also wants to put an end to specialised pension schemes for different trades and industries, but this would only affect new hires.
France has one of the lowest retirement ages in the developed world. In the UK, the minimum age is 66 years old, while in Italy it's 67. And the latest figures show that pensions for men in France are around 74% of pre-retirement earnings. In the UK, that figure is 58%, and in Germany, it's 53%.
Now, polls show pension reform is unpopular. Around 70% of French people oppose any changes, but the government says it's the only way the country's social model can survive, and believes that the general public mood is more inclined towards resignation than anger compared with a few years ago.
Let's talk to Jacques Relon, who's Senior Research Fellow, joining us now from Saint-Malo in France. Jacques, welcome. What is at stake for President Macron when it comes to this pension reform? How important is this?
It's important for his reputation as a reformer. When he came on the scene, when he was elected first in 2017, was new blood. He was going to change and reform France, make it more competitive and all that. And actually, in his first mandate, he tried to impose a reform which was far more ambitious than this one, which the aim of overhauling the whole system and creating a points-based system. But he had to abandon that reform in the face of popular opposition, and use the advent of COVID as a reason for it, to give up on that, because he had other urgencies. And now he's presenting a reform which is not at all revolutionary, which is exactly the same type of reform as his predecessors, Hollande and Sarkozy, did, i.e. you keep the system as it is, but you just increase the age of retirement and the number of years that you need to qualify for a full pension.
As you say, we've been here before, France has been here before. What mistakes do you think were made when this pension reform was originally unveiled?
But this one, this latest one, the main mistake was to give the impression that this reform was needed in order to help France finance the books, balance the books, because France has spent a lot of money dealing with the consequences of COVID, and with the inflation and the fuel prices resulting from the Ukraine war. So the French debt has gone up to 115% of the GDP, and he gave the impression that it was one way of compensating for the amount of money which has been distributed to the French people to bring their energy bills lower, their fuel bills lower, and also all the money that was given to businesses affected by COVID. Now he's changed his tune, realized that in order to qualify to ensure the survival of the French system is a bit special. It is based on the fact that the workers of today pay for the pensioners of today. And the problem that France has is that it's not a problem in a way, it's quite, the life expectancy keeps on increasing. So the number of pensioners is increasing, while the number of workers is not decreasing, and the birth rate is kind of declining. In the 60s, when the system was created after the war, but in the 60s, for example, you had 4 contributors, 4 workers for 1 pensioner. Now we have 1.7 for worker for 1 pensioner, and this ratio could go down. So it is. It would be very difficult to increase the contribution from the workers of today, hence the perceived need for that reform.
Jacques, the detail of this is about to unfold on tea time television across France. How much of what sort of response do you anticipate from the French public when they see the detail of this announcement in the coming minutes?
I think that obviously, as you pointed out, 70% of people are opposed to it. But I think that they will adopt measures to soften the blow. Initially, for example, during his campaign, Macron said it would be 65. Now we're talking about 64. There's measures which will help to maybe make it for people who've really tough jobs, who suffer, who can't work till very, very old, measures to decrease the number of years they need to contribute and to allow them to leave earlier. And the other point is this famous having all people who qualify for a full pension should never get less than 1,200 euros for a pension. That is meant to apply to the new retirees. But I would not be surprised if Elizabeth Borne did not say that this reform would also affect current pensioners who earn less than 1,200 euros a month. So that would sweeten the pill, and maybe at the same time we can see that the problem that Macron has, he has no majority in Parliament. But the Republicans, the Republican right, the party of Sarkozy and Pécresse, is ready to make a deal, because they've always asked for, they always claimed they wanted a reform with raising the age to 65, as Valérie Pécresse said in her campaign. So, but they want to appear as the people who help construct and soften the blow. For example, instead of increasing the pension age by 1 semester a year, it would be by 1 quarter a year, which means that in 4 years' time, the retirement age will raise. The retirement age will raise to 63, and in 2 years' time to 64. So I expect that he might find in Parliament, the debate will take place in February, he should be able to have a majority, but at the same time, the opposition, especially the right-wing opposition, will want to give the impression that they've contributed to measures which will soften the blow of this unpopular reform.
Jacques, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme. Jacques Renaud talking to us there from France.
The UK government is introducing a bill in Parliament which would ensure a minimum level of service during public sector strike action. The bill covers areas including the health service, fire and rescue, schools and border control. It comes amid a wave of strikes over pay and conditions.
Whilst we absolutely believe in the right to strike, we're duty-bound. We're duty-bound to protect the lives and the livelihoods of the British people. The British people need to know that when they have a heart attack, a stroke or a serious injury, that an ambulance will turn up, and that if they need hospital care, they have access to it.
Well, our correspondent Louis Jabarkil has been following this story for us. What effect will this bill have?
Well, it is a bill at this stage, which means that it needs to go through Parliament. What the government has done on Tuesday is introduce the legislation to lawmakers. They'll debate on this. There may be some changes, and then if it's approved, the upper house, known as the House of Lords, will also need to sign off on it before it goes to the King and officially becomes law. That's going to take a few months, but Britain is facing a wave of industrial action right now, which is one headache for the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. What it essentially does, this legislation, is make it harder for strike action in the future. It means companies can sue unions for going ahead with strike action, and we've seen unions take a leading role in some of the strikes we've seen across the UK in recent months. On the other hand, it also targets workers as well. So if people decide to go on strike, some of them could face disciplinary measures, including losing their jobs. The government says that they're doing this because the public are their #1 priority. So keeping things like ambulances and schools going, preventing those strikes impacting the ordinary person in the UK is why they're doing it. And crucially, they're pointing towards Europe and saying other countries in Europe also have similar laws. The likes of Germany, Italy, Spain and France is what Mr. Schatz, the business secretary, said. But critics say it's undemocratic, that it's not going to work and that it could be illegal as well. So even if it does go through Parliament and comes into effect as law, there could be legal challenges as well. So this is the start of a long and tricky route for this legislation if it does go through.
I know you've been saying also that it hasn't quite come out of the blue, but is it going to make a difference? You mentioned the wave of industrial action. Any chance that's going to come to an end soon?
Yeah, this is a sensitive time to be introducing legislation like this. The Conservative Party, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak heading it at the moment, but back in 2019, when Boris Johnson led the party to a general election victory, this was in their manifesto. They said that this was something they wanted to do. But the cost of living crisis over the last year, inflation in double figures, has really exacerbated those calls by public sector workers for a pay rise. And it's not just the pay issue, working conditions as well. Trying to prevent future redundancies is something in the transport industry and for rail unions in particular that they're looking at. Inflation is at close to 11% in the UK at the moment. That's near 40-year high. So the cost of living is a real issue, particularly for public sector workers who are paid generally less than those in the private sector. The opposition Labour Party currently racing ahead in the polls. The next election isn't set until at the latest January 2025, but they say if they come into power and win that election, they're going to rip up this legislation anyway. And there's been strong opposition, and what they are saying, essentially, the party is, after 13 years of Conservative rule in this country, it's clear where the blame lies.
How is the government responding to the crisis of their own making? Not with any attempt to reach a serious long-term solution in the public interest, but by playing politics and promising yet another sticking plaster. He claims he made progress yesterday, but the readout from the trade union representatives was dismal. Is there any chance of a deal this year?
What the government are hoping to do is to prevent the sorts of scenes we've seen over the last month or so. Lots of strikes in the UK where the armed forces had to be brought in and do things like drive ambulances or man checkpoints at airports across the UK. That's the sort of disruption that they want to avoid in the future. In terms of where this goes now, the current strikes taking place, and it's not just the sectors you've mentioned, but also driving instructors, nurses, teachers, all of them are asking for pay rises at the moment. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak met earlier this week on Monday with union leaders and said that there were positive discussions but no breakthrough. So the messaging coming out of the two sides is very different. Just a point on a more immediate solution, looking at one-off payments for health workers, the likes of nurses and ambulance workers. Reportedly, the government are weighing that up to try and help them deal with the cost of living crisis immediately. But really, this is an issue that's going to ramble on, and what comes out of this legislation could change Britain's industrial policy for years and years to come.
Naweed, thank you very much. Our correspondent, Naweed Jabakal. China has stopped issuing short-term visas to South Korean visitors after describing the country's entry restrictions as discriminatory. China's embassy in Seoul said policies would be adjusted subject to the lifting of additional testing restrictions against Chinese arrivals. Beijing has previously said the new measures disregard scientific facts, but South Korea says its policy is based on science and that it's discussing the visa suspension with Beijing. It's also been confirmed that China will stop issuing visas in Japan. Well, our correspondent Liu Jiaxin reports now from Beijing.
Since January the 10th, Chinese embassies and consulates in the Republic of Korea have suspended issuing short-term visas for ROK citizens to China for visits, travels, business, transit, and other general private business, such as medical treatment. Well, the embassy said the measures will be adjusted based on if the ROK side will remove its, restrictions over China. Well, after the full resumption of entry and exit of China, such stringent entry restrictions have not been seen from the United States or from the large part of Europe, but from China's near country, South Korea. On December the 30th, South Korea government has announced a temporary suspension of short-term visa for Chinese, except for official business and emergency ones, and that measure took into effect since January. When Chinese New Year holiday falls, in a bid to avoid vast majority of Chinese enter the border of South Korea. Well, in response to this, during Monday's phone call between Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang and ROK Foreign Minister Park Jin, Qin Gang has, expressed his concerns over these recent restrictions, and he also voiced his hope that the ROK side will uphold an objective and scientific attitude.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, we'll be in Rio de Janeiro for the latest on the storming of Brazil's Congress.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. And a quick reminder, CGTN is available to watch for free on all of the major digital platforms, on smart TV or online at Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Brazil's former president, Jair Bolsonaro, has been hospitalized in the US state of Florida, a day after thousands of his supporters stormed government buildings in Brazil's capital, Brasilia. Bolsonaro was admitted with stomach pains related to a stab wound he received during the 2018 election campaign. The former leader left Brazil for the United States about 10 days ago, refusing to take part in last week's handover of power to President Lula da Silva. Sunday's attack on Brazil's Congress, Supreme Court and presidential offices was the worst threat to state institutions since the country's return to democracy in the 1980s. Our correspondent Lucrecia Franco is in Rio de Janeiro. Good to see you, Lucrecia. So what is the latest on the investigation, on the arrests?
Hello, Juliet. Well, the situation is less tense now as the order has been restored in Brazil's capital, Brasilia. Last night, President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva met with Brazil's 27 governors, the heads of Congress and the Supreme Court. The high-level meeting took place in the presidential palace, which was also severely damaged by the mob of radical Bolsonaro supporters who assaulted the government. institutions on Sunday. All, including allies of former President Bolsonaro, joined the unanimous condemnation of the attack. President Lula said police and Brazilia's intelligence neglected the attack. After the meeting, the leaders of the three branches of government released a joint statement condemning the terrorism, vandalism, and criminal acts committed on Sunday, and described the assault as an attempted coup. Earlier on Monday, thousands of Brazilians took to the streets in Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, demanding punishment for those who enabled the rampage. Meanwhile, an estimated 1,500 people have been detained in connection with Sunday's attack. According to the country's justice ministry, there are being questions as officials are investigating how security forces failed to protect the government. The radical supporters of former President Jair Bolsonaro, who believed the October election was rigged, stormed the three branches of government. They smashed furniture, windows, and valuable artwork in what is being considered the worst attack on state institutions since Brazil's return to democracy in 1985. A rampage that the government says could not have occurred with some form of facilitation. Lula has vowed to use the full force of the law to bring them, the protesters and their financial backers, to justice. His challenge now is to avoid further violence. Juliette.
Lucrecia Franco in Rio de Janeiro, thank you very much.
The head of Disney has told employees to return to the office 4 days a week from the start of March. It's one of several US companies clamping down on flexible working. Someone who's always in our office, our correspondent John Terrace in New York. There you are. Good. Splendid. So Disney wants all the staff back 4 days a week.
Yeah. You know, you're pushing my buttons there, mate, I'll tell you. This is a very sore point, this business about whether people work at home or come to the office. I come to the office every day, and I have done for the last 2.5 years, but that's beside the point. Yeah, the thing is, this story is getting a lot of play here, and the reason for that is that Bob Iger, who is the CEO of the Disney company, Walt Disney Company, is a bit of a business guru, one way and another. You know, some people make an impact in this world, and others less so. Well, Bob Iger has certainly made an impact, and he did it because he was chairman of the Walt Disney Company and the CEO from 2005 through to 2015, when he left to go off and play golf and do that sort of thing. Well, what happened there was a man called Bob Chapek. This is the battle of the Bobs, you see. Bob Iger, Bob Chapek. Bob Chapek took over, and Disney kind of lost its way a little bit, really. Not that there was anything wrong with Bob Chapek. He was fine as a CEO, but the company got into political rows with the governor of the state of Florida, that sort of thing. The share price has been tumbling. I mean, my goodness me, in 2021 it was close to $200, and now today it's at $94. So you can see that's a significant depletion. And the problem, of course, we know very well. One is COVID, particularly in China. We don't need to go there. We understand fully what happened there. Well, the other is streaming, because when they present their earnings, the only thing anybody cares about anymore is what is Disney Plus doing? How many users has it got? How many has it lost? Not that it's lost any, but, you know, that's the thing. And the problem with streaming, when it's the focus of your company, is that there's so much competition out there. Paramount, NBC, of course, Netflix is the big champion. And this is the problem, and that's why the share price is down so much. So Chapek went and Bob Iger took over, and Iger is there to basically shake things up. That's his job. He came back in December from retirement, and he is saying you've got to come to the office 4 days a week. And that's very bold, because this whole thing about whether you work from home or whether you come to the office is a very, very raw thing among American workers at the moment. Those who can do their jobs in front of a PC say, no, save us the 90 minutes commute. We could do just as well here at our dining room table. And Iger is saying, well, it's all very well, but there's no collegiality. You know, if you don't see your boss or you don't see your colleagues, kind of there's something a little bit lost, he's saying. So he's insisting on 4 days a week. The Wall Street banks feel this too, and they're leading the charge by saying come back 3 days a week. And you can really feel this in the car parks at the railway stations around the suburbs of New York. Those car parks are empty on a Monday and a Friday and full Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, because that's what the big banks are insisting. So typical of Bob Iger. He's going that one step further. Guys?
OK, that's Disney. There's another cartoon caper we must concentrate on, the crypto contagion. That's ongoing.
Yes, D. That's not all, folks, is the way you should think of this, because this is going to go on and on and on. This is Coinbase. Now, they had their IPO at the NASDAQ, not here at the venerable New York Stock Exchange, but down the road at the NASDAQ in Times Square. In April of 2021, the share price was $250. It went up to about $328 on the first day, and now it is struggling, to say the least. And Coinbase is axing 20% of its staff. This is the second or third time. It's rather difficult for me to work out how many times they've done this. Certainly the second time, maybe the third time, that they've cut staff. This is 1,000 of them going, 950 to 1,000. And they're basically, the problem is they're running out of money over at Coinbase, which is a sort of cryptocurrency banky type thing. And the problem is that since FTX went under in November, their revenue is down by 50%, so they have no money to pay anybody's wages. On top of that, they've just paid a fine to the leading regulator here of $100 million, $50 million to apologize for not doing enough compliance on people that have joined the company in terms of customers, and another $50 million in order to do better in the future. Now, this is all speaking to the collapse of FTX and the total crippling of confidence in the whole cryptocurrency idea at the moment. Now, the blockchain idea remains sound, okay? But this whole business that sprung up around cryptocurrency, the companies that have come up, what's happened over at FTX, it's all rattling confidence very, very badly. Although I have to say Bitcoin was up a little bit yesterday, at around $17,000. So not very much compared to how it was, but it is going up. Not sure why that is, given all the contagion and confusion that there is surrounding crypto at the moment. Guys.
OK, thanks for that, John. Our correspondent, John Terrett, in New York.
US banking giants are forecast to report lower fourth-quarter profits this week as lenders stockpile rainy day funds to prepare for a significant economic slowdown. JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup and Wells Fargo all report earnings on Friday. Together with Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs, these six largest lenders are expected to amass a combined $5.7 billion in reserves to prepare for bad loans. That's more than double the amount set aside a year earlier.
Amazon has announced plans to close 3 UK warehouses. It's understood that around 1,200 affected workers will be offered jobs at other Amazon locations. This comes just days after the online retail giant announced plans to cut more than 18,000 jobs globally.
BMW car sales jumped in the final months of 2022, signalling an easing of supply chain problems that have been plaguing the car industry. Fourth-quarter sales rose by more than 10.5%, but full-year deliveries were down 4.8% due to supply bottlenecks, the Ukraine war and lockdowns in China.
Bentley has clocked up record global sales. The British luxury car maker sold more than 15,000 cars worldwide in 2022. Sales went up the most in the Asia-Pacific region, rising 23%, while the Americas remain the largest markets.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, reports of a breakthrough for Russian troops in East Ukraine as Moscow ramps up the rhetoric. We're in the Russian capital next.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. from our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London. China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference? The difference is in the detail, in the background,
defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Juliette Mann. Our top stories. Working for longer, French President Macron's pension reforms are unveiled with plans for the retirement age to rise.
With more public sector strikes planned, the UK government proposes legislation forcing minimum staffing regardless of industrial action.
And China stops issuing short-term visas to South Korean and Japanese visitors, describing Seoul's entry restrictions as discriminatory.
Russian forces are reportedly close to capturing a key town in the strategic Ukrainian city of Bakhmut. Britain's defence ministry says forces from the Wagner mercenary group are probably in control of most of Soledar. The United States has previously said the group is trying to take control of large salt and gypsum mines in the area. For months, Ukraine and Russian forces have been bogged down in fighting in the region with little sign of progress on either side.
I asked our correspondent Stephanie Freed in Kyiv whether the town's capture would be a significant gain for Moscow.
Significant, because the same thing that you're hearing, we're hearing here as well, that very possibly Russian forces have taken control of Soledar, which is in it's part of Bakhmut, and Bakhmut has been fought over for months and months. Hard, tough fighting there from both sides, trying to get control. And this change, this control, if it actualizes by Russian forces, would be dramatic for both sides. It wasn't necessarily strategic, Bakhmut, but it is something that, as you mentioned, the Wagner, the mercenary group, the Russian-backed, is fighting inside of Bakhmut. The understanding is they wanted control because of those mines, and to grab Soledar, and the meaning of Soledar is gift of salt, would be significant. I can tell you just from coming out of that area, just coming out of Bakhmut, and hearing what was going on there, the reports are quite accurate in terms of the intensity, the types of artillery, just a broad range, from artillery, shelling, mortars, street-to-street fighting, where we could hear the automatic weapons of street fighting, seeing the smoke rising from the hits, the ground shaking, very, very intense. So if indeed Soledar has gone under Russian or has gone to Russian control, that would be significant for both sides.
Meanwhile, more missile strikes on Kharkiv and other cities.
That's right. Overnight and throughout the day, strikes throughout the east of Ukraine, in the Donbass region, Kharkiv in the north, basically you can just go from region to region to region. There were strikes and there were launches. Zaporizhia, Kharkiv, also Kherson, and Kramatorsk. And in Kherson and Kramatorsk, there were deaths because of the strikes. So there has been no let-up. There had been word over the weekend about a ceasefire, but that really never happened. And certainly this goes on with strikes and with the fighting.
Well, one of President Putin's closest allies says Russia is now in a war with NATO in Ukraine and that the West is trying to wipe Russia from the map. Security Council Secretary Nikolai Patrushev is viewed by many analysts as a hardline influence on Vladimir Putin. It comes as the country's defense minister says Russia will continue to develop its land, sea and air nuclear capabilities. Well, our correspondent Stuart Smith is in Moscow. Stuart, are we seeing a more aggressive tone from Moscow?
It's not necessarily more aggressive. There are politicians that say far more aggressive things than that, but it's a shift in the emphasis, I would suggest, which has been ongoing for the past few months and continues with these comments by such a high-ranking official with such an influence within the Kremlin itself. Nikolai Patrushev is arguably the most influential official closest to Vladimir Putin, the president, and also one who's had his ear for 2 years during the COVID-19 lockdown. He is saying that eventually the aim of the West is to erase Russia from the political map of the world. It's a suggestion we've heard before that this is not a fight against Ukraine by itself, but a fight against NATO, and the fact that the United States will be important to any solution here, and also that Ukraine can only survive because of aid coming from the United States. Now, Patrushev, who's been very influential in this area, is saying that for Russia, this is more than just Ukraine, and that is something that similarly the defense minister Sergei Shoigu on Tuesday was emphasizing again, saying that the nuclear capacity of Russia is what he believes will be the only guarantor of security for Russia. Ukraine, of course, doesn't have nuclear weapons, but the United States does, emphasizing again how Russia fears the United States' influence through Ukraine.
And a new chief of staff at the Russian ground forces has just been appointed. Some people not happy about that. What more do we know?
Yeah, he's been in his post 5 years and then lost his previous post as commander of the Central Military District in October 2022 after a series of Russian withdrawals, and at the time some very high-level politicians in Russia as well as the man in charge of Russia's paramilitary organization Wagner were highly critical of his work. Now it seems, according to Russian state media and other more independent sources, that he has become the chief of the general staff. The Kremlin is refusing to confirm or deny that, but if it is the case, that is indeed a promotion, and there's been reaction from influential bloggers in the so-called Z Telegram channels, those that support the special military operation, but those that don't think the Ministry of Defense is making the right decisions. They seem to be divided on whether or not this is a satisfactory appointment, some blaming him for Russia's previous failures, others saying that the post itself is not all that important, but seemingly the decision has been made to promote him to this post despite his previous failures from the Russian perspective throughout the past year.
Stuart, thank you for that. Our correspondent Stuart Smith in Moscow.
Britain's hopes of becoming a leading destination for the launch of satellites remain intact, says British Business Minister Grant Shapps. Now, it's despite Monday's attempt to make space history ending in failure. Thousands of people will watch the first ever UK satellite launch in the seaside resort of Newquay in Cornwall. But the rocket suffered a technical hitch during flight and failed to reach orbit. Our correspondent John Beaver is in Cornwall. Well, John, this wasn't what we were talking about yesterday, what the big anticipation, a disappointing end to this space mission.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I think the weather here in Cornwall is similar to the mood, fairly grim and downbeat in terms of what was happening yesterday. This was, like you say, meant to be this party atmosphere, this excitement. There were well over 1,000 people, probably more like 2,000 people, who braved the cold and the wind and the rain and were stayed out well past midnight to see this rocket take off. And it was supposed to be the first crucial step when it came to the UK space industry and launching satellites from UK soil. But unfortunately, things all went wrong at the last minute, and it had all started so well.
It was supposed to be an exciting new era for the space industry in the UK. Thousands braved the cold at Newquay Airport to see history being made. A rocket like this replica tucked underneath the wing of a modified 747, making its way to space from the UK. But the party atmosphere at takeoff didn't last. This footage from a test launch shows how the rocket detaches from the plane when the crew push the big red button at 35,000 feet. The first stage engines ignited and the rocket and its payload of 9 satellites started the climb to orbit. Soon travelling at more than 16,000 kilometres per hour, the first stages of the rocket's journey progressed without issue. But then, on the live stream being watched around the world...
Welcome back, everyone. It appears that Launcher 1 has suffered an anomaly which will prevent us from making orbit for this mission. We are looking at the information and data that we have gotten, and we'll be back with you in a moment with more.
And like that, years of work came to an abrupt end. Those involved facing the world's media as they tried to come to terms with what had just happened.
Absolutely devastated. We put our heart and soul into this, and it's such a personal journey for me as well, and my family were here. So yeah, it was pretty rough, but I feel okay, and I think it'll just be a few days of just kind of letting it sink in a little bit.
The investigations are ongoing to work out what went wrong. The reputational damage to those involved is also still unknown.
So, John, what happens next? Are there plans for another launch? I know it's expensive.
Yeah, absolutely. It is hugely expensive when it comes to launching rockets. That, of course, no surprise. And we heard yesterday that something in the region of £20 million, so that's just over $20 million, had already been spent up till this point. But that, obviously, it all ended in failure. There will be more launches from the UK, not Virgin Orbit, the company behind the launch that didn't go to plan, but other companies based up in Scotland, a long way north from here, going for a different style of takeoff with different technology. So they are still very much pushing ahead with that, saying that things will continue. I was due to speak to Virgin Orbit today. I was due to speak to the man in charge, but they cancelled that interview. They said that all their efforts at the moment are trying to work out on what is going wrong. So certainly not talking to the media at the moment, trying to stay upbeat. Financially, this is not good news for them either. Their share price at one stage today was down around 18%. It's rallied slightly. It's now down about 11%. But certainly people asking questions about the viability of launches like this in the future, but everyone trying to stay upbeat, certainly from the UK side of things, that the space industry will continue to play an important role here in the UK.
John Beaver in Newquay and Cornwall, thank you.
The EU's Earth Observation Programme has published its annual report on climate change during a year in which weather extremes caused thousands of deaths globally. And according to EU scientists, 2022 was the 5th warmest on record, with the average global temperature almost 1.2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Well, the report says atmospheric concentrations of the polluting greenhouse gases carbon dioxide and methane reached their highest levels on record in 2022. In Europe, temperatures are increasing more than twice the global average. Last summer was Europe's hottest on record, with the continent experiencing heat waves, widespread droughts and increased wildfires. Dr. Samantha Borges is Deputy Director of Copernicus Climate Change Service. I asked her about the most alarming aspects of this data.
I think the most shocking findings that we found from the 2022 report, not only was it the 5th warmest year on record globally and the 2nd warmest year on record for Europe, that the last 8 years have been the 8 warmest years on record. So the actions and commitments that have been made at the international conferences are not currently seeing a dent in the trends of greenhouse gases, and we need urgent action if we're going to stay within the limits of the Paris Agreement that all global leaders committed to in 2015 of limiting climate change to 1.5 degrees if possible.
Which parts of the world have shown to be most vulnerable in the face of this extreme weather?
I think that's a tricky question to answer, because the reality is all parts of the globe are vulnerable depending on the type and intensity of extreme events. But certainly one of the most shocking events of 2022 for me has to be the devastating floods that we saw in August in Pakistan. But there are a huge number of heat waves across the world as well, and the impacts of both the heat waves and the drought in the Horn of Africa have huge implications for the food bowl in that region as well.
This is another difficult question, I guess. It's more about forecasting rather than looking back at your data. But does your research that your team collected suggest that these extreme weather events are likely to increase in frequency and perhaps severity?
Yes, so that's actually an easy question to answer. So as long as greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere continue to rise, we know from the scientific evidence that extreme events will continue to occur globally, both more frequently and more intensely. We don't know where and when they will occur, but we know the probability of extreme events, whether they're extreme heat waves, extreme droughts, or extreme flooding events, will occur more frequently and more intensely all over the world.
Reading this report makes for pretty depressing reading. I mean, is it all simply too late? Can we honestly really do anything about it?
No, absolutely, it's not too late. And I think that's one of the pieces of information that often gets missed, that every single fraction of a degree matters. So the choices that individuals make, the way they consume or don't consume, really make a difference to the amount of emissions that end up going into our atmosphere, which then has a direct consequence for how warm our planet will be. And we all need to pull together and encourage global leadership to ensure that we can change these trends that we've observed.
Police have begun removing thousands of anti-coal activists protesting the expansion of a mine in Germany. Authorities dismantled barricades and dragged away activists who've been protesting for weeks. The village of Lützerath is due to be demolished to make way for the expansion of a lignite mine. It comes after a regional court upheld a decision to evacuate the village, which now belongs to the energy firm RWE. India is set to demolish buildings in a northern Himalayan town after large cracks developed in nearly 700 homes, forcing residents to flee. Experts have long warned that large-scale construction in and around the town of Joshima, including work for state-run power projects, could lead to the ground caving in.
A record number of delegates from governments, businesses and NGOs are expected at the Swiss resort of Davos next week as the World Economic Forum returns to its traditional winter slot.
The CGTN team will be there to bring you full coverage of the event. But on Tuesday, we got a taste of what we can expect from the organisers. Peter Oliver has more.
This year's World Economic Forum in Davos is highlighting cooperation in a fragmented world as its guiding principle. And with the world fragmented over plenty of issues right now, it does seem like this will be one of the busiest get-togethers in Davos we'll have seen for a long time. Climate change is high on the agenda, and organisers say they'll be looking for policies to deal with that to tie in with the current food and energy crises the world is also facing.
There is no sustained economic growth and development without a healthy planet and stable, cohesive societies, whether you're talking about fresh water or healthy soils. And right now we are seeing escalating risks of inaction, and the longer we postpone the transition, the more risks and consequences we'll likely have to bear.
Inflation is a major issue worldwide right now, and political and business leaders in attendance at this year's World Economic Forum will be tasked with trying to find a solution to make sure that the post-pandemic world economy gets back on track.
To agree on a global growth agenda so we avoid a global recession that includes also agreements on trade and investments. If you have economic growth and no recession, you also create jobs and prosperity.
Do expect Ukraine to loom large over this year's World Economic Forum. Kyiv has announced that there will be a delegation making an appearance, although it hasn't been said one way or the other whether President Volodymyr Zelensky will be attending in person or whether he will send a digital message. We've also heard that there may well be one of China's vice premiers making the trip to Davos, although that hasn't been confirmed by Beijing as of yet. We do know that Robert Habeck, the German economy minister, is slated to be in Davos next week. Also in attendance will be a senior delegation from the United States, including representatives of climate and trade from the Biden White House. And I'll be there as well with a team from CGTN as we bring you all of the very latest from the World Economic Forum in Davos on TV, online and on our app. Do join us for that. Peter Oliver, CGTN, Berlin.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, Paris Saint-Germain's Qatari owners are looking to expand their football portfolio. But which Premier League club have they got their sights on?
I fell in love with Chinese culture the second I started to experience it.
70 years ago, a small group of British businessmen travelled to China to unlock opportunities between the two countries. They became known as the icebreakers.
Building bridges is a natural thing. There is no age and gender difference in our spirit, no race difference in our soul.
I think food is an incredible way of bringing different cultures together. I am enjoying learning every aspect about it.
Chinese literature stretches back for millennia, but it's still really relevant for today.
I hope that Chinese and British fashion community could be more frequently communicating with each other.
An incredible mix of people, cultures, food, and there is so much to see and so much to do.
I have a great desire to make the Chinese civilization more accessible.
It's about our future generation's future.
The craftsmanship, the technique, the material uses, the color uses.
You can kind of take things on board and continue to develop and grow.
Meet the bridge builders, the individuals who dare to think beyond the horizon and open up our world.
Everything seems to have a story. I just think that's absolutely beautiful. A huge tick.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Qatar is looking to expand its football portfolio with some of the Premier League's biggest clubs reportedly on its radar.
Qatar Sports Investment already own the French champions, Paris Saint-Germain, but on the back of hosting the World Cup, the Gulf state has its sights on the most popular league in the world, the English Premier League. The head of QSI reportedly met Tottenham's chairman last week, and the group has also been linked with Manchester United and Liverpool, who are both up for sale.
Simon Chadwick is Professor of Sport and Geopolitical Economy at Schema Business School in France. Good to see you. So will Paris Saint-Germain owners be making a play for the UK Premier League?
Perhaps. I'm led to believe that they're shopping around at the moment. They are keen to scale up their investments in football. They do want to build a global franchise network, if we can call it that, in the same way as Abu Dhabi owns City Football Group. But at the moment, I'm told that they haven't made any firm decisions about which club and where they will invest. So it could be in the Premier League. There have been stories around certain clubs. But at the same time, there could be investments elsewhere across Europe, across the world. And so at the moment, it's them scouting out prospects, I think, more than anything.
Some fans could be rubbing their hands in glee. You know, fans at Tottenham Hotspur, Man United, Liverpool may be excited by the prospect of a big investment. But from a Qatari point of view, I mean, what's in it for the investment group?
They are looking to sweat their assets much more following the end of the World Cup. Obviously, the World Cup did a great deal in terms of bringing Qatar to the world's attention, but that's gone now. And something needs to happen next. And what's going to happen next is I think we will see increased demands on Paris Saint-Germain, the commercial performance of Paris Saint-Germain, and a club ultimately goes on to be the second constituent part of this growing portfolio for Qatar Sports Investments. That club also will be expected to generate a financial return. You've got to keep in mind that what Qatar is trying to do is to diversify its economy away from oil and gas. So it is a case of every little helps. Every additional revenue that comes from those investments is really important. But I also think as well for the Qataris, political profile is significant too. And so it's going to continue with its diplomatic strategy of building relationships across the world, of projecting soft power. So I think it will look at clubs that will enhance their reputation, enhance the image of Qatar. And so it's not just a case of money alone, it's also a case of political returns as well.
But of course, they're very involved with Paris Saint-Germain, so potential conflict of interest issues. I mean, what happens here? Are they going to look to get small stakes in these clubs? Are we looking at potentially a full takeover? Because then they might have to bow out of PSG.
It's likely to be a small stake in a club. So let's say, for example, it does turn out to be a Premier League club. It would be a small stake. There are ownership rules around owning two clubs, not only in England itself, but across the UEFA region. And so therefore what we should anticipate is not a kind of wholesale big money takeover, but a minority stake in a high-profile club somewhere in Europe, so that it doesn't breach UEFA rules and obviously doesn't create that kind of conflict of interest that you've talked about.
And what about PSG themselves? Are they going to continue looking for new ties, new partners?
But at the same time, I think, well, as QSI, should I say, sorry, as QSI looks out to other territories for investments, I think PSG is also potentially open for business too. And QSI will be open to the possibility of others taking a minority stake in PSG. We've heard reports, or certainly before Christmas, we heard reports of Saudi Arabia, for example, taking an interest in beIN Sport, which Qatar Sports Investments also owns. And I think what we need to look at, certainly in the case of PSG, is if there is to be a minority investor, it'll be the kind of minority investor that potentially would take PSG more successfully into the United States marketplace, or possibly to build its presence globally. So none of this is whimsical. It's not based around vanity. It is based around hard economic and political considerations. And as I say, I think in PSG's case, in QSI's case, any entity, any individual organisation, investment vehicle that helps to sweat the asset and to build political capital will be, the organisation will be open to talking to them.
Oh, football is big business, not just a beautiful game. Simon Chadwick, always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
When Neil Christensen was appointed CEO of the global toy maker Lego back in 2017, the company had just recorded its first loss in over a decade.
Fast forward to 2023, and the Danish business is producing record sales and profits. So we asked him to tell us about his first job and what he learnt from it.
And my first job was actually, I was a management consultant with a company called McKinsey & Company back in my very young days, and I think that brought me a good insight into the type of issues that are actually on leadership's agenda and what they're thinking about, how to tackle that. And I did see then different companies, how they operated, different leaders operating, and I think I got, for myself and for my own leadership style, quite a bit of inspiration from that.
Neil Christensen, the CEO of the toy maker Lego.
Your headlines again. Working for longer. French President Macron's pensions reforms are unveiled, with plans for the retirement age to rise.
Our other headlines: with more public sector strikes planned, the UK government proposes legislation forcing minimum staffing regardless of industrial action.
And China stops issuing short-term visas to South Korean and Japanese visitors, describing Seoul's entry restrictions as discriminatory.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
There's more on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live, but we'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.